and welcome to GameSack. It's been nearly 8 years since there was a Regional Differences episode, so I figured, why not make another? Now, in case you're a bit slow, what we'll be doing is taking a look at the Japanese original and the changes they made for us Westerners. Sometimes the changes are minor, but other times they change a lot of things for who knows what reason. Anyway, let's get into it. Karnov on the NES is a fun port of the arcade game. You play as Karnov, surprise surprise, and your mission is to beat the game. Well, at least in the international version here. There's no story anywhere unless you read the instruction manual or maybe the back of the box. But fire up the Japanese version and you're greeted with a nice intro story with its own unique music. That's pretty special considering how there's not a lot of variety in the music in this one. Basically, an evil wizard is causing some trouble, so God put you on the ground. You used to be bad, but now to atone for your previous life of evil, you need to defeat the wizard. Also, between the stages, you get some additional updates to this gripping story. It also has a game over screen that notifies you of your failure. Perhaps these were removed due to their religious nature, I'm not sure. What's funny is that you can put in this Game Genie code into the US game and get the intro back. They never translated it, so it's just gobbledygook, but it's cool that it's in there. This code doesn't restore the between stages scenes or the game over scene, however. As far as the gameplay goes, it's mostly the same as far as I can tell. There might be a few different items that appear in different places, but I really didn't pay much attention to that. Interestingly, the Famicom game doesn't let you continue. The International Edition adds a continue screen, and you can use this as much as you want. There is a hidden continue feature by pressing select and start on the game over screen on the Famicom game, but you can only use it a few times. So all in all, the edition that we got is a bit easier due to the unlimited continues. Also, don't you just love it when content is left out of our localized games?
e-swat.
Here's e-swat, City Under Siege for the Sega Genesis.
e-swat.
This one came out in 1990. This is a fairly decent platformer that could have been really good. You start out as a human cop who can shoot and jump. He controls really well. After 2 stages, you get turned into a dollar store RoboCop. The control kind of craps the bed for the rest of the game and it's awkward at best. The main problem is the jetpack, which lets you fly. You just move way too fast with this. The game overuses the jetpack, and all the years I've owned this game, it's always felt awkward. I wish the entire game was just the human cop, as the game is actually really fun with him.
e-swat.
Anyway, this came out first in Japan, and I remember calling Power Play Games to ask if they had any new games in because I had some cash and I wanted something new. The guy on the phone told me that e-swat came in for the Mega Drive, and I asked if this game had any voices because, of course, that's a question teenage me would ask. He said that it did, and that they sounded like real recordings.
e-swat.
Well, that was all I needed to hear, so I headed down to the store a little later and grabbed this copy. I played it, loving the real voice sounds coming out of my 16-bit Genesis console. I was never able to get past stage 5, however. The US version came out later that year with what is pretty awful box art compared to the Japanese version, in my opinion. And yours too. I've never actually played the US version until today. So what are the differences? Well, for one, the Japanese version is called Cyber Police e-swat Enhanced Special Weapons and Tactics. The international version is called Cyber Police e-swat City Under Siege. And that's it. Wait, no, there's more. The international version removed 2 of the 4 voices that are in the game. The US has the title screen voice and also this whenever you beat a stage.
Mission completed.
But the Japanese version has an additional voice that says this when you beat a stage as the cyborg.
Them the brakes.
And this, presumably, when you beat the game.
Threat has been neutralized.
Why did they remove these from the North American and European versions? The Japanese game is also more difficult. Blasting open these doors will result in new ones closing, for example, making it tough to get by. In the North American and European version, the doors stay gone. There are a lot of little things like this which make this version easier. Lastly, the Japanese version has no continues, whereas the international version gives you 3. Because of this, I was able to make it a lot further in the international version. Oh yeah, and the Japanese version is a touch more expensive if you've got to own this one, just so you know.
e-swat.
Those last two games had some minor yet puzzling changes and omissions, but these next few games have a bit more extensive changes. Let's take a look. Metal Storm from Tantex and Irem for the NES is a great game. Its gimmick is that you can switch your gravity at any time by pressing up and jump. Doing so will allow you to walk and jump on the ceiling as if it were the floor. Pressing down and jump will allow you to switch back. It also has amazing parallax scrolling for the console, probably the best ever on the platform. This isn't the episode to talk about that though. This game was never released in Europe back in the day. The Japanese version has quite a few noticeable differences, the first being an intro that has the planet-destroying thing from Star Wars Episode 7. Uh-oh, now it's targeting Earth. So you need to go aboard this thing and fight your way through it to save Earth. Of course, the North American version boots straight to the title screen. I can't even imagine why they removed this intro. There's certainly nothing scandalous here that tight-ass parents would cry about. Next, the color of your mech is white and orange in the Famicom version and orange and magenta in the North American edition. That is in addition to being partially redrawn. What's more is that almost every stage saw color changes, usually making the North American version quite a bit darker all around. Honestly, I feel the North American version looks better. It's just less harsh and more pleasant to look at. Most of the boss fights share the same colors, and if there are differences, it's extremely minor. The gameplay is mostly the same across both versions, though level 6 features barriers at the edge of the screen which are crazy difficult to avoid in the Japanese game. These are nowhere to be found in the North American version, even on expert difficulty. So once again, they made it easier for us Westerners. These differences are interesting, and I'm glad that they made the changes that they did for our version. What do you think? Here's Strider on the Genesis, which arrived on the console in 1990. This was amazing in its day because it was the first game ever to have 8 mega power. I mean, that's more memory than the human brain. Absolutely incredible. It's a very good port of the arcade game, all things considered, and they really did a good job bringing this one home. The sights and sounds are all here, well, mostly here. Compared to the arcade, there's no longer any voiced dialogue in the cutscenes that are between the stages. And of course, other things had to have slight workarounds, like not having enough memory to animate the Brontosaurus's feet, so they had to hide him behind these bushes. So what differences exist between the Japanese version and the North American/European version which came out later? Well, the Japanese game has more voices. Every single time Strider swings his sword, he says, "Po! Po 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 po! Po 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 po." However, the Japanese version of the arcade also does this. This was removed from versions of the arcade that were released outside of Japan, so it was also removed from the home console ports that were released outside of Japan. Now you just hear a sharp metallic sound when he swings his sword. This makes the Amazon women much more vocal in Stage 4 outside of Japan, since the Genesis can only do one voice sample at a time. I'm not sure if I prefer Strider's sword-swinging grunt there or not. I like voices in these old games, but this one can get kind of annoying. Next, right before you fight the final boss in the Japanese version, there's a voice that says this. All of the arcade versions of Strider have this voice clip, but it was removed from the international home console release. Someone at Sega probably thought that a game saying "all sons of old gods die" was sacrilegious or something. People back then were wimps. Nobody would get offended by that these days, would they? Next, there was a continue feature added to the international release. You can't continue at all in the Japanese game. So yeah, again, because of this, the Japanese version is tougher. Lastly, there were some bugs that were fixed for the international edition, but I never really encountered many, if any, in my playthroughs of both versions of this game. Have you? Here's s.c.a.t on the NES. Yeah, it's called s.c.a.t. This is a horizontal shooter that might remind you of Forgotten World since you play as a human who can turn around and shoot stuff behind him. It's a pretty good little game and quite challenging, but there are some pretty significant differences between the versions. First of all, the North American version is the only one lucky enough to be called s.c.a.t. The European version is called Action in New York. Kind of an odd title for a shooter, but okay. Other than one little thing which I'll mention in a bit, it's pretty much identical to the North American version. The Japanese game is called Final Mission. The stories are different as well. The North American and European games have an intro about alien forces attacking, and you and player 2 have to step up to the task and defend Earth. The Japanese Famicom has a completely different intro. It shows a city getting absolutely obliterated by an immensely powerful alien weapon along with different music. I'll be honest, I like this intro a lot better. Next, let's talk about the gameplay. The Japanese original has options around you and they kind of wander around when you move. You can lock them into place by tapping the A button and unlock them by tapping it again. The international versions have them constantly moving back and forth at all times and you just tap A when you want to lock them. Not only that, but the shots fired from these things are cool looking fireball types, but in the Japanese version they're literally just pixels. How boring. These pixels aren't any less effective though. The Japanese version also doesn't have rapid fire unless you have the laser weapon, whereas the other regions have it on all weapons. Not only that, but when you take a hit on the Japanese game, you default back to the basic starter weapon. Speaking of taking hits, you only have 3 hit points in the Japanese game as opposed to 6 in the others. So yeah, the Japanese version is a lot more difficult. The player death animations are also different. The differences don't end there, oh no. The music is also slightly different in many of the stages. For example, it plays back at a higher key in the North American game than the Japanese one. Take a listen. The European game has faster and higher pitched music which is adjusted for the slow PAL speed of a wimpy 50 Hz, so it'll sound normal if played on a PAL console. This is the only thing adjusted for PAL though, as the game will play slower if you play it at 50 Hz. Next, the Famicom game has a different voice clip at the start of each level. The other regions got rid of all that, and now they only have a single voice clip.
You must destroy them! The Earth is counting on you! Good luck!
You gotta admit, that voice sounds really good for the NES. Oh, and you may have noticed the different graphics between the versions of each stage as well. Lastly, they swapped the order of stages 3 and 4 for the international editions, so you take on the battleship stage sooner in Japan. Overall, I like the North American edition the best, and I feel that they made some improvements and it feels a bit more polished, except for the intro. Up until now, the Japanese versions of these games have been more difficult compared to their Western counterparts. Now let's look on the other side of that coin for a couple of games that are much, much more difficult outside of Japan. This is Exile 2 for the PC Engine Super CD-ROM from Telenet. This is an action RPG where you work your way around side-scrolling locations, killing enemies, leveling up, and then buying things in RPG-style segments. It's a fairly good game, not outstanding or anything, but certainly not bad. It is, however, a touch easy, just like Exile before it, which came out on the TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis in North America. Over here, this game is known as Exile Wicked Phenomenon. Working Designs handled the localization of this one, and like almost everything they touched, they made drastic changes to almost everything they could. Why would they do that? Well, just because they can, of course. The game is now immensely more difficult. The enemies are stronger and you are weaker. The scorpion who dies with 2 hits in the Japanese game now takes 4 hits to destroy. In Japan, you can walk into the first scorpion without attacking and he dies, though it does hurt you. You can then walk into the second scorpion. It dies and you're still alive. The third hit will kill you though. In the North American edition, you can't even survive walking into the first scorpion at all. The strength to experience and levels ratio is also completely borked. Check out how fast this plant thing dies when I'm only on level 3 and I still have the default sword because I couldn't figure out the shops as they were in Japanese. Here in the US version, I'm hacking away at him with 438 experience points, which is level 5, in addition to an upgraded sword, and look how much longer it's taking him to die. He has a lot more life to begin with as well. The entire game is like this, and it gets quite crazy in the later stages once your experience and weapons are all maxed out and you can't grind anymore to compensate. Seriously, some of these enemies take off nearly half of your life if you even touch them. The increased difficulty is not helped by the fact that you walk so damn close to the edge of the screen that you can't see oncoming enemies very well. This was already an issue in the Japanese original. The game is beatable, but that doesn't mean it isn't broken all to high hell. Victor Ireland of Working Designs claims they accidentally made it too hard, but had to go with it because the disc had to ship then, despite claiming that the previous build they had before they made it too hard was almost perfect. Oopsie? The translation itself is full of your typical Working Designs humor, though it's not as bad as most of their later releases would be in this regard. It's still not great though. For example, they really get off on calling the main character Poopy Boy.
This is where your quest ends, Poopy Boy!
One thing for the better that Working Designs had changed was that some parallax scrolling was added to the clouds on the outdoor stages, so that's neat. At least you'll have some cool scrolling clouds and some nice colors to look at as you unfairly die. Also, they changed the game over screen from Roomy at Sadler's Grave to this guy at Sadler's Grave for some reason. Still, I recommend seeking out the unworked version of this game that's hacked to remove the so-called improvements Working Designs made to the difficulty while keeping the translation and graphical improvements intact. Here's the Adventures of Bayou Billy from Konami on the NES. This is a game that doesn't know what it wants to be. It has beat-em-up segments, first-person shooting segments where you can use a controller or even the zapper, and finally, driving segments. This game is called Mad City in Japan, where it came out first on the Famicom. It's a fun game that pretty much anyone can beat. You may need to continue once or twice, but you can definitely beat it. So, being that it's a bit easy, someone at Konami asked for the difficulty to be increased for international regions. And I get the impression that the developers cranked up the difficulty as high as they could out of pure spite over being asked. So, what all did they change? Compared to the Japanese original, the enemies in the beat-em-up parts of the game take twice as many hits to kill and cause you twice as much damage when they hit you. Oh, and they move a little faster too, because why not? Some of the stages feature slightly different designs. In both Stage 1 and Stage 3 of Bayou Billy, you're forced to fight a pair of alligators. You don't need to fight any gators in Mad City, unless you want to. All of this makes the beat-em-up stages a huge chore to get through. For the first-person shooting stages, you start out with less ammo, meaning you need to conserve it and be on the lookout for extra ammo. I can't say that I really had much more difficulty with these stages in Bayou Billy compared to Mad City other than that. The driving stages, though, are now horrible. They were actually pretty fun in Mad City. In Bayou Billy, they made the road skinnier and much more windy, and it also makes them seem more choppy. What's more is that you need to hold up on the D-pad the entire time in Bayou Billy. They also took out the life bar here, which means one-hit deaths and you only have a few lives to make it to the end. Good luck. Still, I did find it easier to hit the planes and the helicopters with my grenades in Bayou Billy than I did with the dynamite in Mad City. What's interesting is that in the Japanese game, there are a few indestructible vehicles that hang around and can kill you with one hit. Surprisingly, they got rid of these in Bayou Billy. I'm surprised they didn't quadruple the amount of them. There are 4 different endings in Mad City, but only one in Bayou Billy, not like most people would ever see it. The changes don't stop there. They updated this one quite a bit graphically as well. Stage 1 features a different texture in the dense trees in the background. Not sure why they took the time to change that, but okay. The crosshair in the shooting stages is now round instead of square. Again, I don't know why, but okay. Your Jeep in the driving stages has even been changed a little bit for some reason. It's wider now, and with the skinnier roads that makes things even more crappier. I'm sorry, I mean more fun. The palm trees and lights from Mad City have been replaced with thicker, boring poles that are of course much easier to run into. Before each stage is now a graphical representation of the controller that you should use for that level. Billy's "Oh God!" close-up in the intro is now more detailed. Billy's colors when he loses a gun stage have been altered as well. The final stage here originally had a red floor in Mad City. The floor is now purple in Bayou Billy. Maybe this change helped them sell a few more copies? Many of the game's enemies have different colors or even slightly different designs. The final bosses look a bit different, and of course they feel like they take a billion more hits. Finally, Annabelle, the girl that you're trying to rescue, shows more skin in the international versions. So that's a good change I think we're all on board with. I mean, usually it's the other way around. Even the sound has changed. There are some very slight changes to some of the music tracks that really aren't worth mentioning, but the added voices sure are. Of course, there's this one now.
The Adventures of Bayou Billy.
But you also get a laugh at the end of each cutscene between the stages. Overall, I'm good with the graphic and sound changes that they made, but man, they went way too far with the difficulty, especially with the driving stages. So I'm going to recommend Mad City instead. It is more enjoyable, even if it is a bit too easy. There you go, a handful of games and their regional differences for you. Now, usually when games were made more difficult in North America, it was because of the rental market that we had over here. Companies were afraid of kids renting them over the weekend and beating them and potentially losing that sale. But come on, who rented out TurboGrafx Super CD-ROMs? I doubt very many at all. Anyway, what are some games that have some regional differences that you find interesting? Let me know. In the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. What the hell? What? Too much mega power? No! No! Wait, how did they turn off my phone too?